So we're learning the Mamar of Beyom Ashtei Asar, Tavshin Lamed Aleph, the Rebbe's Mamar that he saw in Yud Aleph Nissen, and we're learning from the Sefer, which is called Lessons in Sefer Maimorim. We are on page 229. We finished chapter 6. We're up to chapter 7. The last thing that he explained was that even when we say that Yidden choose the Melech over the ministers, there are two possibilities. One possibility is that they choose the Melech over the ministers because of a logical reason. And what's the logical reason? That, of course, there is a level, so there's deeper, but on one level, it could be that Kula Mischaltin Umalka Loy Mischalin, which means all the ministers could be replaced. But Hashem himself, or the king himself, is not replaced. He's permanent, he's eternal. So of course it makes sense to go for what is eternal, which is emes, not something which is temporary. And even that could be explained on two levels. One level is talking about the benefits. That if I'm looking for benefits, I'm better at going to the one that his benefits will be permanent rather than the one that the benefits will be temporary. The higher level is that I'm not looking for the benefits. The fact that it is temporary is that's what indicates, that's what shows us that it's not emes. The fact that the melech is permanent, that means that's emes, and that's why one the Eibishter. Now, even though that's already a much more refined, a much better way of looking at things, but it's still an approach using logic. That I've explained in this chapter, being that the lashon of the pasuk is Chelki Havaya Omra Nafshi, which means my soul chooses. My soul tells me I should choose Hashem over the ministers. It means that it's something deeper than seichel. So that was the Rebbe's question. Is it a seichel-dika choice, or is it a choice that comes from a place deeper than seichel? And the Rebbe explained that seichel ultimately would always find a way of explaining that it should make much more sense logically to go in that direction, which would give me more benefits. Because seichel is looking out for its own metzias, that's me, and therefore I'm looking out for my metzias. Subconsciously, the brain will produce logic and reasons that will lead me to have more benefits, not to have less benefits. So therefore, the Rebbe explains the reason why the Umas Ha'olam, they choose the ministers over the Melech. They can also make the same conclusion that the Melech is permanent and everything else is temporary. But because by doing that, you'll have to forego the benefits that you can get. So therefore, that seichel won't arrive to that conclusion. Again, it's a subconscious influence that it has on the seichel, that the seichel is influenced, and the seichel would be pushed to go in that direction. So the reason why Yidden do see it the right way with seichel is because deeper down we have that connection. It's above seichel, the nefesh. Chelki Havaya Omra Nafshi. So because deep down in our neshama, we want Hashem. Therefore, that has influence on my seichel that it shouldn't deviate, it shouldn't go the wrong direction, but it should go straight and understand that the ikar is Hashem, not the ministers. Is this clear? That's the conclusion of, well, now we're going into Zion. So now the Rebbe is going to start with a question. it doesn't bring it as a question, but an explanation. But the question is, and that's what's needs an explanation, being that Yidden choose Hashem because they and Hashem are one essence. And in fact, if not for that, even the logic wouldn't make sense. That means the main thing is because we choose Hashem because we're connected to Him. So why do we have to bring in the logical process? It shouldn't even say any reason. Just say, and the Yidden choose the Melech, and that's because Chal Kavai Omra Nafshi. Why does the Medrash have to give a reason that it also makes sense to us logically? That's sort of unnecessary, and it takes away from the greater picture, the bigger picture, that we choose Hashem because it's our essence. Especially in light of the fact that the logic wouldn't have made sense if not for the fact that I'm connected, in my essence. So why do we have to have the logic? So that's how the Perek Zayin begins. Perhaps we can add. And we know when a Rebbe says, perhaps we can add, which means I'm not saying this with absolute confidence. As far as we're concerned, it's absolute true. The Rebbe says that, but by us it's different. But for us, the Rebbe's word, if the Rebbe says, I think it might mean this, it's enough. Yeah. The Maimon that Rabbi Chassan says at his chuppah, his chassan, Kabbalah Spanim, in the Maimon there's a story, and the story is about the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab. Now the Rebbe Rashab and the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab told the Frierdiker Rebbe certain inyan and chassidus, was something new, something different. When the Frierdiker Rebbe went to visit his father-in-law, his name was Mamar Beyom Ashtei, and then he came back home. When he came back home, the Rebbe Rashab asked him, so how was it by your father-in-law? And his father-in-law, told him, open the faucet and let it flow. Like, give me some chassidus. Just open the faucet and let it flow. So he told his father, the Rebbe Rashab, I told him that in chassidus that you told me. The Rebbe Rashab said, why did you do that? I told you that this is something which perhaps we can explain it this way. I didn't say it with confidence. So the Frierdiker Rebbe answered, when you is a suffix, for me it's a vada. By you it's a question, for me it's an absolute certainty. It wasn't a question, by you, if you're saying it, that you think it might be this, that's enough for me. If you think it might be this, as far as I'm concerned, it's absolute certainty. Of course, we still need an explanation. So why does the Rebbe say it in the language as if it's not 100% sure? I'm not sure. But one thing we do know, whenever Rebbe uses this language, that means this is something new. Generally speaking, everything the Rebbe speaks about in Maimorim and Sichas, he's always quoting the source. This is from the Kuti Torah. This is from the Mitul Rebbe. This is from the Tzemach Tzedek. This is from the Frierdiker Rebbe. When the Rebbe says about something, perhaps we can explain it this way. We know this is the Rebbe's personal insight, and that to us is much more precious. It's more of a closer connection to the Rebbe himself. Perhaps we can add the fact that the bchira, that in the Neshama, that we choose Hashem from a place which transcends logic, but nevertheless it's channeled through my logic, and therefore it also makes sense to me. So this is something which is even greater than if the choice would have been just because my neshama chooses Hashem. That's why it's important that it should also have a logical explanation. And by the way, those are in the class, I think everyone sitting here is in the class that we did on Mashiach Gula. It's the same idea. Remember, we explained that the reason why the logical mitzvahs make sense to everybody is because Hashem gave it in the Torah. That's why it makes sense. Similar thing over here. The reason why it makes sense is because that's the emes. My neshama recognizes that as the emes, and that subconsciously guides my neshama, my seichel, to go in the right direction. But the question is, What would be wrong if I wouldn't have the seichel part? He might even go a step further and ask, the seichel only presents sort of a risk. If I'm using seichel, it might deviate. I might end up like the nations of the world, thinking that the benefits are better. So wouldn't it be better not to even use the seichel, just choose Hashem, because that's the emes. You and the Behegdim will understand this. First, let's explain what it says in the Siddur, Dibra Maskla, Vadamayinu, Lefar B'Mitzrayim. What does it mean in the Siddur? I don't know if you ever saw this, but there's one of the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe is Maimorim on the Siddur, which means you have a Siddur, and around the Siddur, there are Maimorim explaining different parts of davening. So this is explaining, and in the Siddur it also has the Agoda of Pesach. So there's an Agoda of Pesach, we have the part that says, Avodah Mayinu, right after Manishtana, we start saying, we were slaves to Paro Mitzrayim. So there he explains the whole concept, and very, very often you find when a Maimon talks about the concept of the nations of the world getting a hashpah in abundance, they quote this Maimon for the Alter Rebbe. So there it explains hashpah hanam sheches lever, the sustenance that comes to those that violate his will. It's by the way. It's something which is by the way. Commander Shoda Mosakatfe, like someone who throws it over his shoulder. What does it mean? It's by the way. So he explains with a mashal. Shubadugmas Mela Sha'isa Sudu Mishta. Think of a king that he's making a big feast. And who is he making for? The feast is for his big ministers, the prominent ministers, and the important servants. In a king's palace, there are a lot of kind of servants who sort of the technical work. But there's difference, let's say, between the servant that serves the king his food, goes into the king's chamber for his food, or a servant that's sweeping the floor. That this one has the opportunity to go into the king himself. Let this give him, or other things that are closer to the king. So this meal is for this feast is for the important, prominent officers, and also for the Avodah Machshuvah. And the king spends a lot of money for this feast. As we know, the king makes a feast. We know the story with Achashverosh. He made a feast. The feast lasted for 180 days, and there was everything that you can imagine was there in terms of food and drinks. It was hundreds of thousands, if not more, millions of dollars. So the king spends a lot of money on this feast. However, there's leftovers from this feast. In other words, there's what people ate, and there's what's left after the feast is over. From what's left over, so there's other servants and maids, which are of a lesser status than these servants who were invited to the meal. The servants and the maids that are behind the millstones. In other words, they do technical work. So they're not those that are associated with the king himself. But to the extent that not only they benefit from the meal, that they get the leftovers, but Gama Klavim, even the dogs that hang around in the royal palace, they get the bones that are thrown to them, which are left over from the meal. They get a lot of bones. But of course, the king's intention when he made this meal and he planned the meal and he spent hundreds of thousands of dollars for the meal, it's not because he was thinking, I want the dogs to have bones. And it wasn't even thinking that I want those maidservants to have the leftover, the shirayim. So zesh nishpalam shirayim, the fact that they do get, and by the way, the Rebbe says in the parentheses, Gama Shirayim, even the leftovers of such a feast of a king is also a tremendous value. It's also a lot, because this is a king, not an ordinary feast. This is just as a side thing. This is like, by the way, The intention is to make a feast for the prominent ministers. Intention is to have in mind the prominent ministers and the prominent servants. But once it's there already, so by the way, others can also benefit from it. And that's the same with Hashem. That the intention of Hashem to give hashpah in this world is for those that observe His will. But by the way, who gets hashpah? The Eiler Ritzonim. So this is a mashal how those who violate Hashem's will get hashpah. We'll soon see how the Rebbe takes the mashal apart in detail. The same as in the Nimshal. That the sustenance that comes to those that violate His will is also just by the way, it's a side thing. That's not the intention. Hashem is not directly intending to give them hashpah. He gives them hashpah, like we said last week, as a means to an end. But in essence, Hashem doesn't want to give hashpah to someone who's chas v'shalom murdering or stealing or doing all sorts of evil things. But Hashem is doing it because of a reason. There should be free choice, whatever reason we'll explain. But it's like, by the way, this is not the intention. As our Rebbe explained in that Maimer at length. So now the Rebbe says, yes.
Just now, like you were saying that Hashem doesn't want to give people to go against His will sustenance, and you brought really like drastic examples, like someone who murders and steals. Is this also like anyone who doesn't do His Torah mitzvahs, like even like a regular good person, or the only like the really not so great ones?
No, it's really, everything in Torah, there are levels, higher. So I'm sure that the hashpah that goes to someone who does evil is from a much more mitzumtzum place, much more distant place than the hashpah that goes to someone who doesn't really do evil, but he doesn't do Torah mitzvahs. Plus, as again, we know, and especially in our generation, 99.99% of people that don't do Torah mitzvahs are in the category of tinik shenishba. Anyone know what tinik shenishba means?
Kidnapped.
Right. In the Gemara, it wasn't, in those days, there was hardly such a mitzvah that a person should grow up Jewish in a Jewish family and not observe Torah mitzvahs. But there was another unfortunate situation where children were kidnapped by non-Jews and they grew up in that environment, which means that they never even knew about Shabbos and Kashrus and Torah and mitzvahs. And that means that when they, in halacha, there's one category when you do an Avera and you have intention to violate. There's another category which is called shogeg. You did it by mistake. This is not violating intentionally. It's not even a mistake. This is the category of oinus. Oinus means it's out of your control. The person was raised without Torah, without mitzvahs. They can't even, they can't be blamed for anything. So today, anybody who grew up without Torah, without mitzvahs, which probably we have 2-3 generations like that already, is in that category. So certainly, the chayes that they get is not the same like someone who's chas v'shalom literally doing evil. Of course, there are different levels. Just like when you say about pnimius, that the chayes that Hashem gives to a tzaddik gomer is more pnimius than the chayes to a tzaddik she'eina gomer. And to tzaddik she'eina gomer is more than a beinani. To a beinani, more than a Rosh. There are levels in Kedusha, and also levels in the other side. Yeshleimar. Now the Rebbe explains the mashal. We know when there's a mashal, we learned in class that whenever there's a mashal, it really means that the concept is a very deep concept, but it's hidden in the mashal. And how do we pick up all those deep concepts? By looking into the details of the mashal. On the surface, it's a story, it's an example, but really every detail is precise. And when you start focusing on the details and analyzing the details, you keep learning more and more things about the mashal. In the mashal, he brings 2 examples. He brings 2 examples of those that are not sitting by the king's table. They're not invited to the meal, but nevertheless, they benefit from the meal because they get the leftovers. Page 232. What are the 2 examples? Avodim ushvachas hakrovim. the servants are maids that are ordinary servants are made, not the chshuvim, not the important ones. And the other example is even lower than that, the animals that they get the bones. On the other hand, he also brings two examples of those that are sitting by the king's table. Who are those two examples? Sarim Gedolim, prominent ministers or officers, and the important servants. The reason why he brings these four examples, 2 and 2, because to draw a parallel to the nimshal. And now he's going to explain what's the nimshal. The lowest level is klovim. What's klovim? Dogs, they don't serve the king. Or it's what do the dogs want? All they want is the king should give them food. And they want oid v'oid. The Gemara says, Mashakosov, Haklovim azei nefesh leyodu saba. Which means, these words themselves are a pasuk in Yeshayahu, that the dogs that are, it says here, they fiercely want, you can't satiate them, you can't ever satisfy them. They just want more, give me more and more and more. Which means they have no intention to serve the king. What they want is just give me hashpah. This can be connected with another thing which is known, and that is that the word kelev is made up of two words. The Hebrew word kelev, which means a dog, is made up of two words. Kulei leiv, it's all heart. What does that mean? Teva, the methodosai, the nature of a human being, the way Hashem created us. The Teva Yitzirasai, the way we were created by Hashem, is Shemayach Shalat Alalev, that the mind controls the heart, and the mind rules over the heart. That's what defines a human being. He has a heart. The heart desires different things, but the mind is the one that calls the shots. And the mind is the one that really rules over the heart. So this person that is being compared to Kelev, he's at the other end of the spectrum completely. Why? In this, if he's kulei leiv, all heart means loy rak shalev shalat alamayach. Not only that, instead of the mind controlling the heart, this person, the heart rules the mind. It's deeper than that. You say to him, "Shu kulei lev," it's all heart. In other words, the heart completely takes over, and the seichel is out to lunch. That's the category of Keller. He just does what he just does, whatever he wants, whatever his desire is. So this is describing a certain person who's on a very low level spiritually, that he has he violates the king. He's not one of those people who serve the king. The Mailam is the next step higher than that. The servants and the maid servants who are low, they're the simple ones, they have no importance, so to speak, and they're not invited to the table. These are servants that they don't really have anything to do with the king. So here it says that they're behind the millstone, but I guess it means anything to do. This one carries out the garbage, this one sweeps the floor, this one sets up the furniture, this one is used for carrying things and moving things around. Not like the one, let's say, who brings the king his breakfast, lunch, and supper. He has the opportunity to walk into the king's chamber and to speak to him, or the one that brings him his mail. So he's just a servant, he's not a minister, but he has the opportunity to be in touch with the king himself. Their avodah is coming from a place where they feel compelled to do it, because they fear they shouldn't get a punishment, which means this means that the what defines an eved generally speaking was a lower class person. This is a person that it's not his will and it's not his pleasure to serve a king, even though it's a king, but that's not what he really appreciates. Abda b'afkera nichal at page 234. Yes.
also think that the dog who's all emotioned, like, is probably like, do you think it's related to the fact that he doesn't have the opportunity to see the king? Like people who, for example, the version of that is like people who, like the dog would see the king as this big scary thing who would give them a punishment, whereas the person who gives him the food would see him as a person who's fair and and like has justice, whereas the person who's his advisor would see him as a person who's like warm and whatever else and fair. And it's the same thing of like the more you learn, the more you know.
Right.
Like that would be
Right.
a thing.
Yeah. So there's the one who's in the category which is the lowest. He doesn't see the greatness of the king. He doesn't see the qualities of the king. He just sees the king as a source of sustenance. He's going to give me my meat and my bones. Avda hefkera nichali. This is actually a quote from Gemara that an eved is someone that his natural desire is just hefker. Hefker, you know what hefker is? So hefker is something that doesn't belong to anyone. There's no obligation. There's no responsibility. Just whatever comes goes. So it means sharotzim b'taning shalahem, their desire and their pleasure is b'tayvas elam hazeh. But the only difference between this person and the lower level that we mentioned before is that the lower level actually violates the king's wish. It just goes by his heart. They don't do it. But the fact that the fact that they don't violate Hashem's will is by it's because they're afraid of punishment. But it's not really because of a relationship with the king. Therefore, that explains why their place is also outside of the king's table, because they're really not serving the king in an emissary way. So these are the two categories that are outside of the king's table. Again, spiritually it means two categories of those that don't really have a relationship with the king. One doesn't have because they actually violate, and the other one doesn't violate, but they do it reluctantly. They really don't want to do what they're doing. They would rather do what they feel like doing, which goes against the king's will. But because they're afraid of punishment, they do what the king wants. Then we come to the other two categories that are sitting by the king's table. So one category is also avodim, also servants, but different kinds of servants, the chashuv servants. So like I said before, these are the servants that they have a relationship with the king himself. So Baruch Nisa would mean, Avedasam es hamelech ibaratzim v'cheshek. They serve the king with a desire, with a passion, and they really serve the king with chayis. Hagam sheikra avedasam it's a Kabbalah soil. Although we know it says in Chassidus that an eved is someone that serves the king with Kabbalah soil. It's known the difference between Bain and Eved. There's a famous chapter in Tanya, chapter 41, and then there are many Maimorim that elaborate on this, that sometimes Yidden are called Banim, children to Hashem, and sometimes we're called Abadim, servants to Hashem. What is the difference? An Eved is someone that serves the king with Kabbalah soil, which means an Eved is not necessarily an intellect or anybody that has any special qualities. His qualities are mainly hands and feet and dedication and loyalty. Whatever the king wants, he's there. He runs to do what the king wants. So therefore, in Avodah, it's Kabbalah soil, where I say to Hashem, Hashem, I'm yours. I'm ready to do whatever you tell me. And that's the level that he connects to Hashem. Then means someone is the son of the king. So obviously he also has qualities like his father. And he serves the king because he understands the greatness of the king. He understands the mileage of the king. And therefore, he's motivated to connect to the king and serve him and so on. So Ben and Eved, these are two sort of metaphors for two types of avodah. So the Rebbe is asking, here we're saying that the Eved serves the king with ratzon v'cheshek, which means with a desire and a passion. But it says that an Eved is only Kabbalah soil. So he says, nevertheless, so when the Ben serves the father, is because he loves him. It's more out of just accepting of the yoke. It's not so much the love, more as the loyalty and the dedication. This is my king, and I'm loyal and dedicated. Even Kabbalah Soil, but he still does it with a desire and a passion. They have a desire to accept the yoke of Malchus Shemayim. In other words, I'm doing the Kabbalah Soil, but that itself is my passion. It's not just doing it reluctantly like the other ones that I'd rather be someplace else. No, I am where I want to be, and I enjoy what I'm doing, but my enjoyment is at Kabbalah Soil, not because I understand the greatness of the king, and that leads to Abba to the king, but it's mainly Kabbalah Soil, accepting the yoke of the king. So therefore, these people, they're sitting by the king's table, which means they have a relationship with the king. What's higher than that is the next level is the Sarim. These are the king's officers, the ministers. These are people, Sheishlam Yediyah Banhogas Amlucha. They have understanding in how a country is supposed to run. They understand how you're supposed to lead people in a country. Shalochin, and that's why Kama v'Kama in Yonah Banhogam Esnagam Apiyam. A lot of things in the kingdom, a lot of things that happen in the kingdom is based on their decision, and they're the ones who manage it. They're the ones who lead it because they understand what it means to lead a people and to run a country. They also understand the greatness and the virtues of the king. So they love the king. By them, it's not just doing it in the Kabbalah Soil. They know, they understand who they're dealing with, and they have a tremendous love for the king, knowing his greatness. It's not just because they have Kabbalah Soil. They love the king. So therefore, they're on a higher level. And now this, we don't find it so clearly in the mashal, but the Rebbe says it's also there. Besarim Gufa, even when you talk about officers and ministers, page 236, Yeshtam Kama v'Kama Dargas, even amongst the ministers there are levels. Why? Because in the Maimer he says the words are Sarim Chashuvim, important Sarim, right? What's the Lashon he uses?
Sarim.
Just Sarim? Sarim Agdolim, the big servants. What does it mean? That there are certain, not servants, ministers. That means there are certain ministers that are not big, and there are big. So even though it doesn't spell it out, but by using that term, it makes it clear that there are two levels even among Sarim. Sarim Stam, they're ordinary officers or ministers, or Sarim Gedolim, or prominent officers. That means there are three levels sitting by the king's table. One are those who serve the king with Kabbalah Soil, Avodim. Second are those who serve the king with love because they understand his greatness. And then there's Sarim Gedolim, that they understand the king and serve him with love on a higher level. The Gimel Sugimelu, these three categories, that they're sitting by the king's table and they're close to the king. What are the three categories? Avodim Chshuvim, the important Avodim, Sarim, ordinary ministers, Sarim Gedolim. This corresponds to the three categories in the Medrash. Remember, the Medrash said that when the king comes into a certain country, he comes along with ministers, Duchsin, Yirparchen, Vistotralutin, the three things that we mentioned in the beginning of the Maimer. So again, on this saying, the king comes with different ministers, and in the mashal, there are those who worship the sun, those who worship the moon, and those who worship the stars and the constellations. These are the three categories. But here the Rebbe is explaining it deeper, that these are the three categories of the three. These are not ordinary people. These are people who are close to the king. They really have a close connection to the king, and they can pull strings. They can make things happen. And Koloshana Medrash, they're with the king. So that's when the Medrash talks about the king traveling and he has ministers, he writes, and the ministers were with him. It's like in the mashal, these are the ministers who are sitting with the king by his table, not like those that are outside of the king's table. Okay, now we're going to the next level, something new, which you didn't say before. Anyway, just maybe to make it a little bit easier, there's a little chart in the back, and that's on page 45. The top chart we didn't do yet, so let's wait. But the bottom chart, the one that says the Suda mushal, the second mushal. So this is who's sitting by the king's table, and these are who are not by the king's table. So there are three categories: important ministers, ordinary ministers, important servants. Important ministers observe Torah mitzvahs with great love, ordinary ministers with ordinary love, and the important servants with Kabbalah soil. Then those who are not by the table, two categories. Simple servants, they observe but out of fear. We mean fear, not awe, but fear of punishment. And then the dogs, which they are those who don't even serve the king, they violate Torah. What is he going to introduce now? It's something new. Based on this, we can say, even though this mashal of the three people with the king is really alluding to the 70 angels. So I made another chart here. And that's on page, we've got a picture how things work. In case you want to know the mechanism. So look at page 48. Please. Sorry, I didn't mean it as a command. It's just a suggestion. Perhaps, maybe, if it's not difficult. In other words, this is the order of how things come from Hashem to the physical world. The origin is spheres of Atzilus. Then it goes through Malachim, which are Malachim of Kedusha, holy Malachim. And then from there it goes to the 70 angels, which is Klipa of Noiga. This is Klipas Noga. The first level, it says Malachim, they're not Klipas Noga, they're Kedusha. But then from there it goes to the 70 angels of Klipas Noiga. And then the sustenance goes through, this is the itinerary, you want to say, to the sun, the moon, and the constellations. And from there, it comes all the hashpah to nature and all the things that are happening in the Gashmistic world. So he's going to explain now that the simple pshat here, when it says they choose the ministers over the king, it's referring to the angels of the Ayin Sarim. They know that these 70 angels give them hashpah, and therefore they want to get more hashpah from the 70 angels, and they worship them. And that's Avodah Zarah. That's Avodah Zarah. But over here, the Rebbe is going to say something much deeper, even more than that. But for that, we'll have to wait 24 hours. No, not 24 hours, less 3/4 of an hour. Tomorrow, 8:30, Mitzvah Hashem. We'll continue. So we're stopping off here at page 236. Loch Rab, everybody. Next week?
Yes, I think on Thursday. I think on Thursday.
Very funny.
I
You
think
sent it to which email? Rabbi Majeski at Gmail?
Oh, no,
Sure.
yes.
Okay, I think,